The antique shop on the corner of the main street in my small town had long since become more than just a workplace. It was an entire world I had created for myself. It always exuded tranquility, the scent of old books, the delicate dust on gilded frames, and the muted light filtering through the curtains. This world was my refuge from reality, from a marriage that had over the years turned into the shared cohabitation of two weary people. Michael was kind, dependable, but increasingly distant with each passing year. His silence filled our home like a dense fog, obscuring everything beyond an arm's reach. Morning after morning we sat at the same table, exchanged perfunctory phrases, and watched the clock, as if each of us were waiting for some signal to part ways. We both knew something was gone, but neither of us dared to say it aloud. The shop was my salvation. Here, I lost myself in the history of things. Each item carried an entire life within it, someone's lost dreams, endured love, or quiet joy. But one day, among the many stories I surrounded myself with, my own suddenly began to change. It happened on a quiet autumn morning. The day started as usual. I was arranging antique jewelry in the display case and straightening books on the shelves. The soft chime of the bell above the door made me turn around. A man stood on the threshold. Young, with a casual elegance to his attire and a confidence in his posture. His dark hair was slightly tousled by the wind, and his eyes, lively and attentive, seemed to see more than what lay on the surface. "Good morning," he said, smiling. His voice was warm, with a subtle playfulness to it. "Sorry to bother you, but I was told you're an expert in antiques." I nodded, feeling a shift in the air. He pulled a pocket watch from his coat pocket and placed it on the counter. I took it in my hands, feeling the cold metal, but I couldn't focus. My gaze kept returning to him, to this man who was unlike any of my usual customers. "This was my grandfather's watch," he continued. "I'd like to know if it has any value beyond the sentimental." His words struck a chord in me. I, too, owned many things that held memories, but no market value. I began explaining the watch to him, its year of manufacture, its possible origin, but I sensed he was listening not just to my words. His gaze seemed to study me, as if trying to understand who I was beyond the confines of this shop. When he left, I stood by the window for a long time, watching as he disappeared into the crowd. For the first time in years, I felt something strange, a faint thrill, as if someone had opened a window in a stuffy room, and this man, whom I had known for only a few minutes, was the one who had let in that fresh air. The day passed in its usual routine. I sorted through old books, dusted the delicate carved frames, and answered the occasional questions of rare visitors. Yet thoughts of that young man lingered in my mind. His image, his confident posture, calm smile, and a voice laced with a faint hint of playful irony surfaced over and over again. It felt as though his presence had left an invisible imprint on the air. A few days went by, and life, as always, began to settle back into its usual rhythm. Michael still returned from work, ate dinner in silence, and occasionally spoke about his day, which I no longer found interesting. I listened, nodded, but my thoughts drifted back to the shop, a place where no one asked unnecessary questions, a place that, as it turned out, held the potential for unexpected encounters. On one of those days, the doorbell chimed again. I looked up and froze. It was him. "I hope I'm not being too intrusive?" he asked, tilting his head slightly. "But I thought you might be able to help me with something else." I tried to remain calm, though my heart skipped a beat. "Of course. What can I help you with?" I replied, layering my voice with professional detachment, though I felt that detachment cracking at the seams. This time, he brought a small silver candlestick with intricate engravings. The object was delicate, without obvious value, but I noticed he was using it more as a pretext for conversation. "You know," he said unexpectedly, leaning on the counter, "I'm curious. How did you get into this? It's not every day you meet someone who seems to belong in a place as much as you do in this shop." His words caught me off guard. I was used to blending into the background, unnoticed, absorbed in my things. No one ever looked at me as if I could be interesting too. His eyes seemed to underscore that sentiment. I want to know more. It sort of happened naturally, I replied, fidgeting with the fabric of my apron. I've always loved antique things. They tell stories. Most of the time, they're stories of the people who once held them in their hands. And your story? He asked, looking up at me. I wasn't ready for such a question. My story was so simple, predictable, so dull that I didn't even know what to say. It's not very interesting, I said with a smile, trying to change the subject. I think antique clocks are far more fascinating. But he didn't look away. There was a hint of gentle disbelief in his expression, as if he saw something in me that I hadn't noticed in myself for a long time. The conversation didn't end. It lingered in the air, like the seed of something yet to come. Well then, maybe you can help me figure this out. Ben shifted the topic as effortlessly as the wind changes direction. I heard about an antique auction in the next town. Care to join me? I could use an expert, and you seem like a true guru in the field. I laughed. His ease was disarming, though I still tried to maintain my distance. Auctions aren't easy, I remarked. Items are expensive, and mistakes are best avoided. That's exactly why I need you, he said with a wink. I won't manage without you. I felt my lips curl into a smile almost involuntarily. Was I really about to agree? Was I about to step outside the confines of my familiar world? Something inside whispered, "Do it." And before I could think it through, I said, "All right, just this once." Ben laughed, clearly pleased with his small victory, and bidding me farewell, left the shop. His presence faded, but this time it left something more, a sense of anticipation. On Saturday morning, I stood in front of the mirror, slipping on a light cardigan. I couldn't explain why I had spent so much time deciding what to wear. After all, it was just a trip to an auction, nothing special. Yet, I felt as though I were preparing for something important. My heart fluttered with a faint excitement I hadn't felt in years. Ben arrived precisely on time. His car was old, with a thin layer of dust on the hood, but the inside was spotless, as if he cared about making an impression, even in the smallest details. "You look wonderful," he said as I settled into the passenger seat. His words were so casual that it took me a moment to realize they were a compliment. I waved it off. "It's just an old cardigan." "Well, then you have a talent for making old things look fantastic," he replied, turning on the radio. The drive flew by. We talked about everything, the movies he'd recently seen, how I first got into the antique business, the music I loved in my youth. Ben had a knack for listening, not just nodding, but truly immersing himself in the conversation. I started to feel strangely free, as though there was no need to pretend around him. When we arrived at the auction, the grand old building greeted us with heavy wooden doors and the muffled hum of visitors' voices. I felt at home again. Here, among vintage furniture and intricately carved mirrors, I could be myself. Ben, on the other hand, looked like a child walking into an amusement park for the first time. "Do you think they're all actually this serious, or are they just trying to look smarter?" he asked, nodding toward a group of people poring over the auction catalog. I laughed, covering my mouth with my hand. "A bit of both. It's all about the game, pretending you know more than the others." "Well, since I brought you along, I'd say I've got an ace up my sleeve." We started browsing the lots. Ben kept asking questions, pointing out items that caught his attention. His genuine curiosity was refreshing. Many of my customers came to the shop seeking status or indulging a whim. Ben, however, seemed to look at each piece as if searching for something authentic. When the bidding began, I realized I was enjoying not just the process, but his company, his jokes, his genuine interest. It all lit up something inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. By midday, we were sitting in a small cafe near the auction house. I felt a lightness I hadn't known for years. "You really have an incredible knowledge of antiques," he said, taking a bite of his sandwich. "I feel like you could give a whole lecture on the subject." "And you're just the kind of person who tells people what they want to hear, aren't you?" I teased, though I could feel my cheeks warming. No, he replied seriously, I just say what I mean. His sincerity caught me off guard. I looked away to hide my embarrassment. For a moment, there was silence, but it was warm, like a cozy blanket on a chilly evening. Thank you for today, I said when we returned to his car. I haven't had this much fun in a long time. Then we'll have to do it again, he said, opening the car door for me. His tone was light, but there was something deeper in his eyes. I didn't respond, but I felt that familiar flutter in my chest. Ben, it seemed, had no idea how much I'd changed in such a short span of time. Or maybe he did, and that thought somehow amused him. After that auction, in a town where days flowed like water, something inside me seemed to awaken. I found myself thinking about Ben more and more. His smile, his ease, his ability to ask unexpected questions, not just to fill silence, but to uncover something genuine. But I pushed those thoughts away like persistent flies, returning to my usual life. The shop, dinners with Michael, the occasional conversation. Everything else now seemed even duller by comparison. One evening, as I was preparing to close the shop, the familiar chime of the doorbell rang. Ben walked in, holding a small paper bag and a bottle of wine. I thought a workday should end with something enjoyable, he said with a broad smile. You're full of surprises, I replied, feeling a smile form on my face despite myself. But a shop isn't exactly the best place for celebrations. Then let's go to a bar, he suggested, as casually as if we were old friends. I wanted to say no. I wanted to tell him I had things to do, that Michael was waiting for me at home. But the words caught in my throat. Something inside me seemed to shout, go. And so, I went. The bar was small with soft lighting and quiet music, where the smell of fried food mixed with the aroma of polished wooden panels. We sat by a window. Ben ordered a beer and I ordered a glass of wine. It felt strange, drinking not at home, not with Michael, but with someone who felt entirely different, almost forbidden. Now be honest, Ben said, leaning closer. How long have you had this shop? Over 10 years, I replied, twirling the stem of my glass between my fingers. After college, I realized office work wasn't for me. The shop became something of a refuge. What about you? What do you do besides puzzling over antiques? He smirked, leaning onto the table. Oh, I'm a multitasker, architect, sometimes I do photography on the side, and now I'm fascinated with old things, trying to piece together other people's stories to figure out my own. His words struck a chord. I thought about my life, about how I'd spent years trying to build stability, only to lose myself in the process. And your story? He asked suddenly. I don't mean work. What makes you... you? I froze. No one had ever asked me that before. I looked at him, searching for an answer. I guess I'm just someone trying not to fall apart, I said finally. Ben chuckled, but it wasn't mocking. There was warmth in it. You don't seem like someone who's falling apart, quite the opposite. There's a light in your eyes, though it seems like you don't notice it. I stopped. His words touched something inside me, something I had worked hard to hide, even from myself. Do you have someone? I asked unexpectedly, trying to shift the focus. No one serious, he replied with a shrug. It's not easy finding someone who's not afraid to see more in you than you're willing to show. I felt my gaze grow heavy. Michael. He used to be like that. Once, he had the same spark I now saw in Ben, but years of life together had worn it away, replacing it with habit. And you? He asked, gently steering the conversation back. You mentioned your husband. What's he like? Michael. He's a good man, I said, though the words sounded too mundane. We've been together for over 15 years. Our relationship is calm. Is calm a good thing? He asked, not judgmental, just genuinely curious. I thought about it. The calm I had once strived for suddenly seemed stifling, like still water with no current. Sometimes yes, and sometimes I feel like I'm stuck. Ben didn't respond, only looked at me, as if trying to read something deep within my soul. That evening, those words, that man, they made me feel alive in a way I hadn't in years. Ben showed up at the shop late in the evening, just as I was about to close. He walked in, holding 2 cups of coffee, and smiled. I couldn't resist. Thought you might have a little time for a conversation. I hesitated, but eventually agreed. We stepped out onto the small summer veranda behind the shop. The night was warm, the stars shone brightly, and fireflies flickered in the grass. Ben settled into a wooden chair, stretching out his legs, and handed me one of the cups. "Do you like it here?" he asked, gazing up at the sky. "Yes, this is my place," I replied. "But sometimes I feel like something's missing." He nodded, as though he understood more than I expected. We talked about life, about the search for happiness, about how easy it is to lose yourself in routine. The conversation flowed effortlessly, as if we'd known each other for years. When I looked up, our eyes met. His gaze was so intense, so deep that it took my breath away. For a moment, everything else faded. Just him and me. And before I could think about what I was doing, we leaned toward each other. His kiss was extraordinary. I felt something within me break apart, and at the same time, something new was born. It was a moment that changed everything. After that evening with Ben, I felt as if I were caught between 2 worlds. At the shop and with him, I felt alive, real. At home, everything remained the same, calm but hollow. Michael didn't seem to notice the changes in me until one evening, when he asked a question that caught me off guard. "You've been distracted lately. Is everything okay?" His voice was gentle, but there was a hint of suspicion in it. "Of course, everything's fine," I replied too quickly, avoiding his gaze. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on me a moment longer than usual. Over the next few days, I started noticing how he watched me, his gaze holding just a little too long, his questions carrying a subtle undertone, as if he were probing for something deeper. Then I began feeling unwell, fatigue, dizziness. At first, I blamed it on stress, but something inside me whispered that there was more to it. When the symptoms didn't go away, I went to see a doctor. Sitting in the doctor's office, hearing the word pregnant, I was momentarily speechless. There were more questions than answers. I knew this wasn't Michael's child. Our relationship had long since become purely platonic. Returning home, I tried to act as if everything were normal, but Michael noticed. "Are you sure nothing's going on?" he asked, watching me with growing suspicion. "No, everything's fine," I lied again, though inside I was consumed by fear and guilt. Each evening at dinner, every glance he cast in my direction reminded me that my life now teetered on the edge between truth and deception. It all happened quickly, like the jagged rhythm of a racing heart. I knew I had to talk to Ben before the situation spiraled out of control. We met at a small cafe. He was sitting by the window, a beam of sunlight illuminating his face, accentuating the softness and lightness that had always set him apart from others. "You look worried," he said, as soon as I sat down across from him. His voice was attentive but tinged with concern. I sat in silence for a long moment, gathering my thoughts. "I'm pregnant," I finally exhaled. His eyes widened, then lit up. He leaned in closer, his face reflecting a mix of joy and wonder. "That's incredible. We'll figure this out no matter what you decide. We can start over, together." His words cut deep. They carried so much hope, but I already knew I couldn't share it. "No, Ben, it's not that simple," I said, my voice trembling. "I have Michael. I have my life. I can't destroy it." "But you're not happy. You've told me that yourself," he said, his voice pained but firm. I turned away, unable to meet his gaze. "It's his child," I lied, feeling as though I was tearing myself apart from the inside. "And we shouldn't see each other anymore." Ben fell silent. His face hardened, his expression becoming unreadable as the light in his eyes slowly dimmed. He nodded, realizing there was no point in arguing. "If that's your decision," he said quietly. "I won't interfere." I barely held back tears as I watched him rise from his chair and walk away. When he left, I felt something inside me break completely. Returning home, I tried to appear calm, as though nothing had changed. Michael was in the kitchen, cooking dinner, one of those rare gestures of care that he occasionally offered. "How was your day?" he asked, turning around. His voice was gentle, but his eyes were still searching, as if he suspected something. "Nothing special," I replied, feeling the weight of my lie. My life now felt like a thin sheet of ice. Every step threatened to crack it. Weeks passed, and I worked to restore some semblance of normalcy. I suggested a vacation to Michael, started taking more initiative in conversations, and pretended as though our life was full again. But deep inside, I knew it was all a facade, fragile and insubstantial. It was hardest when he looked at me with hope. One evening, we were sitting on the couch when Michael placed his hand on my stomach. It was a gesture of love I hadn't seen from him in years. His voice was quiet, almost a whisper. "We're going to be okay. I feel like this is our chance." I smiled at him, trying to project confidence, but inside an icy emptiness spread. There was truth in his words, a truth he couldn't possibly know. But I did. And that truth, like a razor, cut me from the inside out. Each day I lived in fear that my lie would be exposed, that one day Michael would realize this child wasn't his, that everything we were trying to rebuild now would crumble under the weight of the truth. Yet, I kept playing my part, knowing there was no way back. That night, lying in bed, I stared at the ceiling, thinking about what I had done. Michael slept beside me, his breathing steady and calm. I closed my eyes and whispered into the darkness, "Forgive me." But the words weren't meant for him.